Purnima, a child imprisoned, a soul set free. Bhutan, March 1st, 1993. It was especially cold and late in the evening when the police once again rounded up the group of believers and hauled them to the district administrator's office. 13-year-old Purnima shivered as she and the others were forced to stand out in the open courtyard while the interrogation droned on. The officers bombarded them with the same questions they always ask. Why do you want to be a Christian? Where does your support come from? This is a Buddhist country, and you have dishonored us by accepting this foreign religion. Why do you want to turn your people against you? One by one, the 35 believers were questioned throughout the long, cold night. There were about 20 officers, most of them big and intimidating. Purnima cringed as one of them slapped a Christian brother near her. Some in the group cried, others tried to preach. Young Purnima stood before the men who towered over her, praying for enough courage to face the impending questions. Who gave you permission to celebrate Christmas in the village of Purta? This is Bhutan. You are not allowed to celebrate Christmas in Bhutan. This is your last choice. You either return to Buddhism or you leave Bhutan. And the officer was speaking directly to Purnima now, and she felt the impact of his ultimatum. Do you understand? You are not permitted to stay here and practice this foreign religion. What will it be? Purnima didn't doubt for a minute. The officer was serious. It was a matter of honor to either get the Christians to recant or to publicly denounce them as traitors and force them out of the country. She had already been kicked out of her home and her village. She had no idea where she would go, but she knew what she must do. I will not deny Christ. I do not wish to leave my country, and I will not leave Christ. He is the only one who can save me, or you. Purnima could feel her body shake as she spoke definitely to the red-faced officer, but her heart was fixed, and in that moment she knew her fate was sealed. She and the others were officially given 5 days to leave Bhutan. They were told to go to Nepal. 5 days. Purnima had less than a week left of the life she had always known. Word of the officer's threat had quickly spread throughout the area, and her sister and brother-in-law had already left, fearing for their lives. Now that the Christians were officially labeled traitors, some of the more outspoken villagers took that as a license to attack them. Before Purnima could leave, there was one thing she had to do. She needed to see her mother. A little more than a year had passed since her parents had forced her out of their home. Now she found herself sneaking back, confident and that what had already reached them about her imminent departure. She prayed her parents would be willing to see their little girl one last time. Under the covering of nightfall, Purnima made her way back to the house she grew up in, the home she had been forced to leave at the tender age of 12. A miraculous recovery. Purnima had grown up in a small Buddhist village in the green hills of eastern Bhutan. Her father was the local witch doctor and often led rituals and performed animal sacrifices to drive out evil spirits that threatened to harm their community. Their family of 8 was neither rich nor poor by local standards, but they had a large home and a close relationship. Sival, who was married to Purnima's older sister Maya, also lived with them. Purnima probably would have grown up like any other kid in her village if the ailing Maya hadn't recovered so miraculously. For 3 years, Purnima had watched again and again as her father sacrificed chickens on his makeshift altar, beating a homemade drum and calling on the spirits to heal his daughter. Afterwards, Purnima would sit by Maya's bed, expecting her to get better, but Maya didn't improve. She had good days and bad days, but the incessant pain in her stomach and severe headaches often kept her in bed for days at a time. Watching her sister suffer, Purnima had frequently asked her mom, "Why are the spirits so mad? Why aren't the sacrifices working?" But there were never any answers. Now, after the painful years of illness, Maya was up and about. No more pain, no more ringing in her head. Purnima's mother and father were glad. Their daughter was feeling so much better. But they were not pleased about Maya's new claim that Jesus had healed her. How can you say such things? How can you bring such a dishonor to your home and community? Their father exclaimed. We are Buddhists, and I will not hear another word about this foreign god. Do you understand? Not another word. He was furious. Worse, he was fearful that what the local villagers would think if they found out. In fact, he was afraid for his own life, but Maya and Seville couldn't deny their newfound faith. When one of the Seville's friends had learned of Maya's illness, he had confessed of being a secret Christian and had given Seville a Bible. He had also told Seville he believed Jesus could heal Maya, and he had, and after that, their faith had grown quickly as they read their new Bible together. If you insist on being Christian, you can no longer stay here, Purnima's father had declared to Seville and Maya that final evening. The villagers will never allow it. They will drive us out too, and your new religion will bring disgrace and calamity on the whole family. Purnima was heartbroken to see her sister and brother-in-law driven from the family home. However, even at the young age of 10, she understood all too well that what her father was saying was true. She knew the villagers would never accept this new religion, and yet she couldn't help but secretly be in awe of Maya's restored health and the new look that brightened her whole face. Even as Maya packed her meager belongings to leave the only home she had ever known, adding to the pain was the fact that Maya was 6 months pregnant. After they left, the home felt as if a death had occurred. Purnima's mother was depressed, and her father seemed full of bewilderment over what had happened to his family. Purnima wanted to talk to her mother about Maya, but no one was allowed to even mention her name, and no one was allowed to visit the couple in their place of exile, a tiny bamboo hut a few miles outside of a neighboring village. But when Purnima heard that Maya had given birth to a baby boy, she couldn't take the loss anymore. She marveled at the fact that her sister had given birth to a healthy baby, and she still wasn't able to shake the curiosity that made her continually think about her sister's amazing healing. She imagined that the baby must look like. Powerful questions relentlessly invaded her thoughts. What kind of God would heal without asking anything in return? What did Maya and Civil find in their religion that gave them the courage to stand against their families and society, even to the point of being expelled from their home? These questions caused Purnima to boldly sneak to her sister's home for that first wary visit. Cutting across fields and keeping out of sight in the trees, she quickly covered the distance that had separated her from her sister for many weeks. When Maya opened the door of the humble little hut to find Purnima trembling on the doorstep, her startled demeanor quickly melted into a barrage of tears and hugs as she enveloped her little sister in her arms. Purnima began to sneak out regularly to visit Maya. She could never stay long, sometimes leaving after only 15 minutes. But each time she came, Maya would read Purnima a story from the Bible, and she listened intently, absorbing every detail. She was most fascinated by the story of Moses, not so much by the wondrous powers of God displayed through him, but by the fact that he was forced to leave his home and eventually became the mouthpiece of God, even though he had difficulty speaking. If she was Christian, she imagined, she would want to be like Moses. The following year, Maya gave birth to another child, Esther, and Purnima's visits came more frequently. To young Purnima, it had been an adventure to slip along the footpaths of the village to visit her exiled sister and her young niece and nephew. Even if she was caught, she reasoned, she wouldn't get in too much trouble. After all, she was just a kid. But Purnima's mother didn't see it that way. Purnima, we both know what you're doing, she told her one day. I've already lost one daughter. I don't want to lose another. Do you understand? Purnima nodded in agreement as her mother went on to explain that Christianity was a foreign religion, and for a lower class of people. It was not for our village or our country. Maya had been duped by Civil and her friends. Her mother concluded, inexplicably drawn to God. But Purnima loved the time she spent with her sister, and the secret visits continued. On Christmas Day, Maya and Silva permitted Purnima to join them in the small fellowship that had been formed over the past 18 months. The many visits with her sister had firmly planted seeds of faith in Purnima's heart, and as she listened to the sermon about the birth of Christ, how he was born of a virgin and came to bring salvation, she felt herself being inexplicably drawn to call out to God in her heart. For days she told no one of her decision to trust in Christ until she sneaked another visit to Maya, and she told her she wished to be baptized. Maya was overjoyed at her sister's decision, but inwardly she worried how Purnima would handle telling her parents the news. About 3 weeks later, on a bright Sunday morning, Purnima was baptized. She emerged from the water overcome with conviction. Maya, I know what I must do now. I must tell Mommy and Daddy the news. I can't hide it any longer. I want everyone to know that I now live for Christ. I don't care what they say or do. But Purnima, you are so young. You're only 12, and you know what they will do. Are you really ready for that? I had civil, so it was a little easier for me to leave home. Perhaps you would just wait to tell them the news and keep praying. Purnima was unwavering. I can't do that, Maya. Now I understand all the things I had been hearing, all the things you told me from the Bible. I had never felt this way before. And I know it is real, like you said. How will I ever be able to hide it down inside and not tell Mommy and Daddy? Besides, I have you. Maya melted at the remark and embraced her sister. Of course, you always have me. Do you want me to come with you? No, Purnima answered. It's too dangerous for you to come near the village. Don't worry, it'll be okay. Maya watched with mixed emotions as her little sister ran off towards home. She couldn't believe the youngster's audacity, and though she was afraid of her parents' reaction, she felt tremendous pride toward Purnima for her boldness. Perhaps the Lord had special plans for her, she mused. In her 12-year-old innocence, Purnima simply came home and blurted out the news. Mom, I'm a Christian. Her mother freezed at the words. Surely you're joking, she said apprehensively. You're too young to be a Christian, and besides, I told you I wasn't going to lose another daughter. But Purnima confidently confirmed her decision. Mom, I don't want to leave like Maya did. I want to stay, but I have decided to become a Christian, and nothing could change my mind. She was forced to leave that same evening. As she made her way down the now familiar path to Maya's home and her new possessions, behind her she could hear her mother crying. She knew her mother loved both of her daughters, but her parents were afraid of what the villagers would do to them. Earlier, Purnima had been afraid too, but as she walked in the darkness, she decided she would not be afraid any longer. She had lived with Maya and Silva since then, and while she enjoyed being with her sister's family, conditions there were cramped, and they all struggled to survive. Then the arrest started on Christmas Day, 1992, exactly 1 year after Purnima's conversion to Christianity. The village police had grown increasingly fearful of the growing number of Christians in the area and had stepped up their pressure on the believers. The Christians had endured 10 interrogations in as many weeks, and each time the authorities had tried to persuade or coerce them to deny Christ and return to their Buddhist roots, the men had been slapped and beaten. Some of them had been held for a week or more in a large detention center, where they were beaten even more severely. The detained women were humiliated and accused of prostitution. In response, some members of her group had agreed to deny Christ, but young Purnima only grew more obstinate. Now, to Purnima, her older sister Maya, her brother-in-law Sival, and the friends from neighboring villages who regularly fellowship with them, the authorities' latest directive was simple but heart-rending. Leave Bhutan. How can you be so brave? Continuing through the fields, Purnima saw the lights shining through the windows of her parents' home. What used to be her home, she wondered what she would tell her mother. She wondered if her mother would even let her inn. They had not spoken or even seen each other since the night Purnima had been sent away. Now forced to leave Bhutan, and she also wondered if she would ever see her mother again. And as she quietly approached the front door, she decided to simply let herself in. Mom, it's me, Purnima. Her mother grabbed her daughter tightly. Please tell me you're home to stay. Please tell me you're not a Christian any longer. Purnima remained silent for a few minutes. She could see how sad her mother was. The tears were already flowing. She didn't want to cause her mother any more misery, but she had to tell her, Mom, I have to leave Bhutan. The police won't let me live here. I'm sorry. Her mother looked at her young daughter and envied her bravery. But she was still so young, so innocent. Purnima, you are not yet 14. How can you be so brave? How can you forsake your country? Purnima was now crying with her mother. I'm not forsaking my country, Mom, she sobbed. My country has forsaken me. She knew how much her mother loved her, and she knew she had never wanted to force her out of the house, but everyone was so afraid of the Christians, afraid of Christmas, afraid of Christ. Purnima couldn't help but wonder what made them all so scary. Here, take this. Purnima's father handed her a small wad of money. And please be careful. He looked into his daughter's teary eyes, gave her a quick hug, and left the room. Purnima remained with her mother for a few more minutes, trying to memorize every feature of her face, the tone of her voice, the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled. Her mother was so beautiful, and she didn't know when or if she would ever see her again. One last hug, and then Purnima disappeared through the fields one last time. Her sister's family had already left, so the following morning Purnima joined 8 other Christians from her fellowship who were also being forced out of Bhutan. The government had provided a bus to take them from their village of Purta to the border of India. From there they would be on their own. Who will be our guide? They kidded among themselves, attempting to relieve the anxiety. None of them had ever ventured out of their surrounding community. None had any knowledge of the place they were going. A short distance past the border, the bus stopped, and the 9 refugees got off. They watched through the wall of gray exhaust fumes as the bus turned around and pulled away. It was their last contact with Bhutan, and now it was gone. They had been told simply to walk that way through the hills of India into Nepal. Haunted by dreams. The Christians journeyed 3 days by foot without incident, but grew increasingly exhausted from crossing the mountainous terrain. Coming to an unusually large tree along the road, John, who had become their unofficial leader, suggested they camp out under the tree for a day or so to regain their strength. There was no rush, but the reality of their dilemma was beginning to set in, and Purnima was growing increasingly fearful. She didn't want the others to know, but she had been crying herself to sleep, and since leaving her village, vivid dreams of her mother had been haunting her sleep. This night would be no different. March 8, Purnima's birthday. Purnima snuggled next to her mom, looking up into the clear night. They loved to gaze at the stars together, pointing out imaginary shapes. Being the younger daughter, Purnima was able to spend more time with her mom, and she never felt more secure than when the two of them were alone together. So, birthday girl, what are you going to do now that you're all grown up? Her mother jested. Grown up? What do you mean, grown up? I'm only 14, Purnima said, giggling. She often felt trapped between her youthful spirit and the limited responsibilities of being adult, but tonight she was just her mother's little girl. Purnima's joy was short-lived, abruptly ending when she spotted 4 officers coming out of the field towards them. She began to panic, realizing the men were coming for her. Curiously, her mother didn't seem to notice. Before Purnima could escape, the 4 officers had surrounded her. One of them tightly grabbed her, driving his long fingers into her arm so hard that Her hand tingled from the restricted blood flow. "Let me go, you're hurting me," she pleaded. There was no answer. Slowly Purnima was being pulled away from her mother and away from her home. Both seemed to dissolve into the distance. "Mom, Mom," Purnima's voice echoed back towards home. "Please help me. Please make them stop." But it was no use. Her mother sat silently on her chair as if nothing was happening. Purnima awoke with a harsh jerk, taking a deep breath as her mind slowly came back to reality. She could taste the salt from the tears that had dried around her mouth. She wondered if she would ever get used to feeling so alone. It was pitch black, and only a sliver of the moon was visible, casting a faint glow on the large branches above her. As her body began to shiver, she pulled her light jacket tighter around her shoulders, bunching up the sweater that served as her pillow. Purnima's eyes peered through the darkness. She was amazed how frightening the silence of the night could be. "Is it really my birthday?" she thought to herself. Purnima tried to figure out what day of the month it was, but it was no use. The events of the last few weeks had happened so fast she had lost track of the days. Not that it mattered now. She wondered how she would survive the days, weeks, and even years to come. All she knew for sure was that she was terribly homesick, and as she drifted back to sleep, Purnima thought again of her mother's sweet face and the warmth of her touch. Bruised, bleeding, and broke. Get up, and hand over your money, and we will let you live." Purnima was rudely awakened by loud voices and the impact of a heavy boot slamming into her side. "I said, get up." The pain ripped through her body as the unknown assailant kicked her again. She couldn't tell how many men were attacking them, but there was several of the bandits. Her small group offered no defense. The vivid cries of her traveling companions told her that they too were coming under the harsh blows of the thieves. Purnima tried to shield herself as she was repeatedly kicked and beaten. Paralyzing fear gripped her body, but suddenly a verse from the Bible flooded her mind, and she thought it was from the Gospel of Matthew. "Do not fear those who kill the body." Kill the body, she repeated to herself, praying that wasn't to be her immediate fate. Her mind raced as she remembered the lot of money her father had given her. As the mob continued to rampage through the makeshift camp and plunder their meager possessions, Purnima struggled to grab the money hidden in her belongings before the thieves discovered it. Her hand found what it was looking for just before she received another painful blow that landed squarely in her back, knocking the wind out of her. She cried out to God as she brought her arms in to protect herself, and attempting to roll away from the harsh boot that kept smashing into her body. After the outlaws had sufficiently terrorized the weary refugees and confiscated all their possessions, the robbers lined up 4 of the Christians, including Purnima. None of the refugees dared to say a word as they stood facing their attackers. There were about 12 of them, each with a bandana tied around his face. Purnima looked at the others standing beside her. Each was frozen in fear. She knew it would be nothing for the thieves to shoot them on the spot. You should not report this to the police," one of the men warned as he carelessly swung a pistol in front of them. "If you do, we will come back and kill you." His fingers remained on the trigger, and he continued pointing the gun in each one's face to reinforce his words. Purnima closed her eyes and wondered if she would hear the gun go off. Then she opened them. The thieves were gone. The wounded victims gathered together as best they could and began surveying the damage. Although they were thankful to God for sparing their lives, all of them were bruised and bleeding, and all quickly realized they had nothing left. The thieves had taken everything, even their extra clothing. Never had they imagined that their journey to Nepal would harbor such dangers. The next morning, John managed to wave down a large farm truck that had a homemade wooden box behind its rusty cab. Learning the truck was heading toward Nepal, He pleaded with the driver as the others quickly gathered around. "Can you please take us with you? We cannot stay here. It is too dangerous. Do you have any money?" the elderly driver asked as he stepped out of the cab, assessing his opportunity to make a few extra dollars. John explained how they had been robbed the previous night and had literally lost everything they owned. "Please," he continued, "some of our group can barely walk after the beatings they received." But even after he had seen their wounds, the driver of the truck refused to give them a ride. He was still focused on making a profit. John and the others began to turn away, discouraged by their lost opportunity of a ride. When Purnima spoke up, "I have some money," the others looked at her in astonishment, wondering how she could possibly have any money after what they had been through. The robbers had been extremely thorough in their search. "Let's just say I hid it carefully," Purnima said, smiling as she handed the money to the driver. The youngest of the 9 refugees became their hero as they all hugged her and piled into the back of the truck. It wouldn't be the last time Purnima's clever and generous nature would come in useful. The rising afternoon sun refreshed the small group of Christians and helped fight off the endless chills from sleeping on the cold, damp ground. And while most took the opportunity to get some sleep, Purnima again thought of her mother, and for the first time she started questioning whether she had made the right decision. Perhaps she should have kept her faith a secret, as Maya had suggested. She opened the Bible Sybil had given her after her baptism and remembered to thank God that the thieves had found no use for it. Turning the pages, Purnima quickly found her favorite passages. She had read them 100 times and marked them so she could find them more easily. Ever since her early visits with Maya, she had been fascinated by the adventurous stories in the Bible. She thought about Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt, about how David had run from the hands of King Saul, and about her favorite Bible character, Moses, who had fled from Egypt. These stories fueled Purnima with courage to face another day. Clutching her Bible, she knew she was in good company. Reunited refugees. As evening fell, the driver finally stopped in the Indian town of Asun and told his passengers he needed to refuel and pick up some supplies. Then they had a few hours before they would depart again, he said, taking a much-needed opportunity to stretch their legs. Purnima and the others began walking through the town, eventually meeting a local pastor. The pastor was originally from Bhutan, and he was amazed by their story and their willingness to leave all behind to follow Christ. He was especially taken by young Purnima. He pulled John aside and asked him how old she was. "I'm not sure, either 13 or 14, John replied. "Is she traveling with any family members?" the pastor inquired. "No, her sister's family is also heading to Nepal, but they left ahead of us. We don't know where they are." The pastor couldn't help feeling sorry for young Purnima, but asked John if he should invite Purnima to come live with his family. John agreed that it would be a good idea. He had worried about her too. He encouraged the pastor to present the invitation directly to Purnima. Purnima agreed to move in with the pastor and his wife. It was refreshing to be part of a family again, but it wasn't her family, and she continually prayed to be reunited with Maya. She didn't know how it could possibly happen. She just prayed that it would. 3 months had gone by after the pastor invited Purnima to join them as a Christian at a Christian conference they were preparing to attend outside Assam. She happily accepted, unaware that her brother-in-law Sybil would also be attending. She was thrilled to see Sybil again and quickly decided to go back to Nepal with him, a decision that saddened the pastor and his wife. "Are you sure you want to leave, Purnima?" the pastor asked. "Do you know how difficult it will be for you in Nepal? You will be forced to live in a refugee camp." Purnima listened to his gentle argument, knowing he was right. The pastor and his wife had treated her like their own daughter, and it was hard to leave them. But her mind was made up.
Yes, I'm sure, she answered. I want to be with my own family. I appreciate all your kindness, but I believe this is God's will for me. Purnima and Silvilla arrived at the refugee camp on the northern border of Nepal, late on a cloudy evening, so she could not see the details of her new home right away. All that mattered at that moment was seeing Maya again. The sisters fell into each other's arms with shrieks of joy. Afterward, Purnima fell asleep quickly on one of the thin bamboo mats. Purnima, wake up! Little Esther was running around Purnima's head, clapping her hands and laughing in the overcrowded hut. When Purnima opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the rickety bamboo frame covered with thick plastic, the roof of their hut. As she sat up, she heard what sounded like hundreds of people bustling around right outside the entrance of their hut. Quickly, the camp's congested conditions and the utter poverty of the thousands of families living there became apparent to Purnima. The more she saw the camp, the deeper she sank into despair. Maya, happy to be together with her sister again, tried to bolster Purnima's spirits. Listen, Purnima, she told her little sister. I know this place stinks, but God's hand is always on us, no matter where we are. He must have work for us to do here. Just think of all the people here who have never heard about Christ. And you know how people are always drawn to you. They listen when you tell them about God. Maybe because they are not used to seeing such a young and pretty preacher. Purnima blushed and smiled. I suppose so, she said. But how long do you think we'll have to stay here? Is it really God's plan that we never get to go home again? Maya had no answer, but she pulled Purnima close and held her tight. She wanted to be strong for her little sister, but the truth was, she had often wondered the same things. As the weeks wore on, Purnima slowly discovered the do's and the don'ts of camp life. Do try to obtain an outpass when attempting to leave the camp and go out into the surrounding villages. Don't tell the authorities you're going out to preach the gospel and hand out tracts. Don't conduct big meetings with the other Christians in the camp. Stick to small groups and house church meetings. Do take advantage of the language classes offered, and so on and so on. The refugee camp had a culture and life of its own, and that was unlike anything Purnima had expected. A passion for sharing the gospel. The high point of camp life for Purnima was the fervent growth of the church that was occurring among the thousands of refugees. She enjoyed the security of the family of Christ and the close friendships she had developed. Many times she and her friends would sneak out in small groups undetected to visit other Christians in neighboring camps and villages. They used these opportunities to practice their new language while preaching. Purnima felt most contented during these adventures as she continued to discover her gifts for music and her growing passion for the lost. Wrapped up in the passion and of sharing the gospel, she could almost forget the wretchedness of camp life. Purnima and her friends continued with these gospel sharing expeditions outside the camp until the following year they were caught. The group had set out in the early dawn of a brisk Sunday morning in August for the 2-hour trip to Hona's place. Hona had heard about the spirited Christians in the refugee camps and had invited a group of them to a fellowship in his home and evangelize in the local marketplace. Purnima and the others willingly accepted. Quietly, in groups of 2 or 3, 11 of them snuck out of the refugee camp and met about a mile down the road, carrying Bibles, a few gospel tracts, and a guitar. The Christians were excited at the prospect of preaching in a new village to people who might never have heard the gospel, but they knew they would have to move quickly to be back to the camp by nightfall. They arrived at Hona's home by noon, and after fellowshipping for a few hours, they left for the marketplace. They had barely set up to sing a few songs when Purnima and the others were accosted By 5, I have police officers. Come with us, they ordered. The startled group had no choice but to follow the officers, and soon found themselves sitting before a stern-looking captain. Where are you from? He demanded. Who permitted you to come out of the camp? Who gave you permission to spread your religion in Nepal? You have no rights here. All day they waited in the dank, dark jail, where the captain questioned them individually. The men first, and then the women. Purnima was growing tired, and thinking this was just a misunderstanding, decided to challenge the officer. We haven't done anything wrong. Why are you holding us here? Please let us go. We have to get back to the camp before it gets dark. No, the captain shouted. Tonight you will stay with us, and tomorrow you have an invitation from the district commander. Purnima cringed at how pleased the captain appeared to be for arresting and detaining them. She and the other 3 women were locked away in a tiny, filthy cell, where they huddled together and fervently cried out to God throughout the night, asking for his protection. They had known it could be dangerous preaching in Nepal, but so many who had never heard the gospel were eagerly accepting it that the rewards seemed worth the risk. The next morning, the police gathered the 11 Christians back together. If you have some money, you may buy something for lunch, one of the officers told them. Now we are all taking a long walk. Purnima exchanged a questioning glance with her friends, but decided not to worry too much. Surely this would all get straightened out today by the district commander's office. All day they trudged through the jungle, 11 Christians and 9 policemen with guns. I guess we must look pretty dangerous, Purnima contemplated, eyeing the weapons. Her muscles stiffened, rebelling against the rough terrain. Because she and the others had no money, they had no food and no water except for when they crossed a stream. It was dark when they finally arrived at the district office. Purnima was exhausted, cold, and hungry, but she still felt encouraged that God was with them and was confident they would be returning home soon. But her hopes were dashed as soon as the questioning began. 5 officers sat behind a thick wooden table in the dimly lit interrogation room, and they barked questions at the Christians in a wave of anger. Who gave you permission to preach in the Jahapa marketplace? Who is supporting you? Where did you get your materials? You are dirty refugees. You have no rights here. Anyone who tried to answer the shouted onslaught was slapped or kicked, but the prisoners were also slapped and kicked when they didn't answer. For hours, the questions and the beatings went on until another officer stepped in and said, Enough, no more tonight. Give them some food and we will continue tomorrow. The conditions in this cell were even worse than in the first jail. Purnima choked back the bile that rose in her throat as the wretched smell hit her. The cement floor was cold, and there was not even a bucket for them to use as a toilet. In the morning, Purnima and the other women waited in their cell with apprehension. The officers started taking the prisoners up one by one and questioning them. The district commander told Purnima they had proof that she and her friends had destroyed a Buddhist temple and insulted their gods. No, it's not true, Purnima cried in disbelief. The officer slapped her hard across the face. You insolent little liar, he screamed. Just tell us the truth and you will have a light sentence. If you continue to lie, you will go to the federal prison, and for a long, long time. Purnima was starting to panic, but she held her ground. Again and again she was slapped and kicked, and after a while she fell into a surreal state as the man's cruelty enveloped her, with the expectation of the mugging that first dark night in India. She hadn't really known men could be so evil, but throughout the next 28 days she was to receive a harsh education. It was a difficult lesson for a 15-year-old girl. The long days of interrogation dragged on as the officials continued their mission of wearing down the spirit of Purnima and her friends. The routine was always the same, except they never knew who would be called out first for the daily round of questioning and beating. Question, wrong answer, slap. Another question, another wrong answer, another slap, and on and on. In this cell, Purnima and the other woman sang softly and prayed long into the night, trying to encourage each other with hopeful words. "Just hang in there. It will all be over soon and we will be going home," they whispered in the darkness. Home, Purnima thought ironically. Now there's a relative term. Glowing with the peace of God. In the camp, Purnima had continually thought of her parents and how much she missed her home in Bhutan, but now she missed her sister and the sordid little hut in the overcrowded refugee camp more than she would ever have thought possible. She wondered what her niece and nephew were doing, and worried how Maya was holding up. Had she received any news at all of Purnima's whereabouts? "Oh, Maya, I am so sorry to cause you so many problems." You must be going crazy," Purnima thought. In fact, some Christians in the refugee camp, including the fellowship pastor, had heard rumors of the group's arrest. They had even traveled to the detention center where Purnima and the others were being held, only to be severely beaten by the officers and then turned away. The 11 imprisoned Christians were made aware of what was happening, and they were devastated by the unprovoked assaults of their friends. On day 25 of her incarceration, one of the guards came early for Purnima. The district commander was waiting for her in the familiar interrogation room, ready to inflict his cruelty. Once again the question started. "Who told you to preach? You are so young. Perhaps it is not your fault. Surely someone has coerced you into this religion with the promise of money. Who sends you support? If you just tell us who it is, the beatings will stop. Maybe you can even go back to the camp." For Purnima, the next few minutes seemed an eternity. Tired and worn down physically from lack of food, the prisoners were fed rice twice a day, and dirty from being unable to bathe. She nevertheless felt the peace of God glowing inside her during these sessions. Losing herself in the presence of Christ helped her immensely as she prayed for God to forgive her tormentors and give her strength for whatever came next. "Answer my questions," the commander screamed. Purnima summoned her courage as she braced for a slap. She knew he wouldn't like her answer. "I didn't accept Christ for the sake of money or support or anything else. I accepted Christ because my sister was sick for 3 years, and then she accepted Christ and was miraculously healed. I have seen many miracles, and I have peace and joy. There is no other reason." Frustrated, the commander came within inches of her face. Smelling his breath and seeing the dark fury in his eyes scared her, but she tried not to recoil. "You lie, he shouted in her face. "I know you are hiding something. You are not telling the truth. Now you will have to go to prison for a long time. Are you ready for that?" Before Purnima could reply, he slapped her hard, knocking her off the chair. "Take her back to her cell," he ordered. Purnima's cellmates gasped when they saw her frail, bruised face already starting to swell from the vicious slap. "Don't worry," Purnima lied as tears formed in her eyes. "It's not as painful as it probably looks." The women knew otherwise, as they too had received their share of pain and humiliation from the heartless officers. They comforted Purnima as best they could, commiserating over the officials' unwillingness to believe their story. The policemen just couldn't seem to believe that Purnima and her friends were not receiving outside financial help from foreigners. They were convinced that Bibles and tracts had come from outside Nepal because Christianity was a foreign religion. They refused to accept that it was spreading indigenously without compulsion or the promise of personal gain. The next few days passed quietly as Purnima and the others wondered about their fate. Prayer and quiet singing helped ease their minds and pass the time, but Purnima had a sense of unease about the sudden lack of interaction with their captors. What could they be What could they be doing? Why aren't they letting us go? She wondered. How blessed I am. Finally, early on Tuesday morning, September 20th, the group was again gathering in the district commander's office. Purnima knew something was up because until then the women prisoners had been separated from the men. Little was said as the refugees were unceremoniously lined up and handcuffed, then marched across the village square to the tin-roofed courthouse. Purnima was so elated to be out in the sunshine, even for a brief moment, that she forgot to worry about what awaited them. The room was full with the group, as the group was escorted to the front and seated next to their court-appointed lawyer. On the opposite side of the room, the government's lawyer indicated he was bringing official charges against the 11. Ironically, as the contrived charges were read, a list of lies that included the destruction of the Buddhist temples and the killing of sacred cows, Purnima actually began to feel hopeful. Perhaps this would be the day of their vindication, and they would go free. Surely the judge could see they were innocent. Their lawyer argued convincingly enough, but the prosecutor obviously had a script to follow, and making an example of the Christians seemed to be his main goal. As the day dragged on into the evening hours, it was nearly 10 that night when the judge finally made his decision, and the sentence was read to the weary group. Purnima stood as her name was called, along with other prisoners. A shock jolted her body as the judge sternly announced that they were to be remanded to the federal prison for a term of 3 years. 3 years! The words rang through Purnima's mind. Purnima had promised God she would be faithful no matter where he sent her. Away from home, out of Bhutan, into a refugee camp. But prison? It was more than the 15-year-old could bear. She closed her eyes and again sought comfort in the Bible stories she had committed to memory. She imagined Jesus sitting on the mountaintop, instructing his disciples, and she felt her courage build as the familiar words swept through her mind. Blessed are those who are persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are those. Matthew 5:10. She stopped as she realized the truth. Blessed am I. It was hard to think of a prison and sentence as a blessing. Purnima's spirit and soul accepted the fact before her mind did. But in the days to come, her promise would become the source of the prisoners' bedrock of strength, as they frequently repeated the words in unison. Now they were shackled 2 by 2 and led from the courtroom to begin yet another arduous journey through the jungle. The prison was on a mountaintop several miles away as Purnima's mind replaced the court hearing. She grew increasingly convinced of God's role in what was happening to them. They had been falsely accused and were going to prison because of the cause of Christ. This knowledge was comforting to Purnima, and she felt privileged to be called to suffer for Christ. Looking at her 10 friends as they trudged through the jungle, she knew again that she was in good company. Welcome to hell. They reached the prison gate at 3 in the morning. In the moonlight, Purnima was able to make out the high wall surrounding the compound and the huge outer gates that gave an ominous creak as they opened for them. The place had a somber and imposing atmosphere and looked like it once might have been a grand fortress, but now was in a serious state of disrepair. As they walked on through the open courtyard toward the inner buildings, Purnima stole one last glance over her shoulder as the grand gates closed behind them. The loud clang reverberated through the prison, her new home. Purnima and the other women were handed a thin straw mat and led into their cell. It was almost pitch black, but gradually their eyes could make out the silhouettes of others sleeping on the floor. An eerie voice rose from the ground. Welcome, welcome to hell. Purnima anxiously wondered who her cellmates were. What crimes had they committed? Were they violent? Would they like her? The unanswered questions threatened to unnerve her as she found a vacant spot along the outside wall and pulled her knees tight to her body. She was exhausted but felt too frightened to sleep. Within a few hours, a glimmer of sunlight came through the barred openings high up on the walls, allowing Purnima and her friends to observe their surroundings. The room was not large, but it was not overcrowded. There was 5 other prisoners in their cell, and each woman had apparently claimed her own space, clustering her meager belongings around her on the floor. The bathroom, if you could call it that, consisted of a raised cement pad adjacent to the outside wall. There was a rusted sink, but no soap, no hot water, no door. A hole in the cement opened into a dugout pit that Purnima suspected, judging by the smell, had apparently never been cleaned out. The stench from the pit filled the cell. The prison's concrete walls were stained with layers of paint and had given way to years of grime. The floor was cold, all damp and filthy. A small interior window, about eye level, allowed the prisoners to see out into the courtyard and toward the much larger men's cell on the opposite side of it. Far above the courtyard was a railed catwalk from which the prison guards could keep watch. Although Purnima had seen no guards there yet, Tolasa was the self-appointed leader of the cell. "Why are you here?" she asked bluntly, looking directly at Purnima. "You're a little young to be locked up, don't you think?" "I don't know if I'm too young," Purnima replied, "but we're here because we are Christians." "Christians," Tulsa almost spat out the word. "And why would they lock you up for being Christians? Stupidity isn't against the law." The others joined in her laughter. She introduced herself, but there was no warmth in her words. "They say I killed my mother-in-law," she snarled, "so I'm going to be here a while, and I would appreciate it if you kept to yourself." Purnima couldn't help but stare at the woman, even though she felt intimidated by Tolasa's harsh words. Somehow Purnima suspected a gentle, caring soul existed behind the cold facade, and from that moment on she prayed that God would give her an opportunity to find it. Tolasa returned to her corner of the cell, letting loose a stream of profanity as she went. Purnima noticed she had an ample supply of blankets and other personal effects, an indication that Tolasa had been there for a while and had received some items from friends or family members on the outside. The newcomers, on the other hand, had come with nothing except the clothing they wore. That first morning they huddled together and prayed, committing to being each day in prison and to fast every Friday. The new inmates were given basic cooking utensils, and each day they received 2-meal rations, and usually rice and potatoes. Usually they were given a small allotment of money so they could buy personal items. The Christians soon discovered that adjusting to prison life was in some ways like adjusting to life in the refugee camp. Learn the rules, try to steer clear of trouble, watch your back. The glaring difference, of course, was their complete lack of freedom and the guards' unwillingness to step in when trouble inevitably occurred. But Purnima thought at least they didn't have to face daily interrogations and beatings here, and they could enjoy their quiet times of fellowship, despite the incessant mocking of the other inmates and the constant onslaught of filthy language. Purnima's greatest fear arose from the prison guard's sexual innuendos, which had started shortly after she arrived. The first few months dragged by, and Purnima got little sleep. She quickly learned why the other inmates hadn't made their home along the outside wall. It was cold there, her health was declining, and with the onset of winter, and she had neither warm clothing nor even a single blanket. Slowly her optimistic outlook was being replaced by an inner feeling of despair. Realizing what was happening, Purnima worried about her vulnerability and her declining faith. Again she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Her dreams of home, of her mother, had also returned, making the nights even more unbearable. She was ready to give up. One afternoon, Purnima had heard screams coming from the men's block, followed by angry voices shouting, "Get him, finish him off." It wasn't unusual for fights to break out in the men's cells, but this time chills went up her spine when she heard a voice yell, "Just finish him off. A dead Christian can't pray or sing." Purnima knew the threats were real. Tulasa had told her someone had been murdered in the men's cell shortly before their group had arrived. Knowing it was one of her fellow Christians who was facing death at the hands of the other inmates, Purnima called frantically for the guard, but none came. Sobbing, she collapsed onto her mat and prayed, and in that moment she realized how much harder imprisonment was for her brothers, crammed into a cell with more than 200 other men, many of them violent criminals, than it was for her. She saw how absorbed she had become with her own self-pity. While across the courtyard, one of her friends was being beaten, maybe even killed. "Dear God," she prayed, "please don't let them kill him. Please don't let him die." Then she wept, and this time not just for herself, but for all of them. A brother named Ashok had been the victim of the attack in the men's block. He had survived, but barely. Thankful for his recovery and determined to shift her focus off herself, Purnima looked for ways to be a witness to the other woman and in her cell. She knew she had to somehow remain active if she hoped to survive the 3-year sentence. In the past weeks, she had allowed not only her body to be imprisoned, but her soul and spirit as well, and the situation had to change. "Show me what I can do, Lord," she prayed. "I am free to serve you no matter the circumstance." It occurred to her just then that it was almost Christmas. The Christmas gift. The man known only as Uncle had become a permanent fixture at the federal prison. He had been there so long and wandered around the prison so freely. New arrivals usually believed he was part of the staff, but he wasn't. Each week he made his rounds of the cell, asking the prisoners if they wanted him to buy them something at the market. "Good morning, Purnima," he called out to her this day. "What can I get for you today? Are you just going to keep all your money until you're released? Why do you save it anyway? What good is it if you don't spend it?" Just as he spoke the words, the idea came to her. "That's it. That's what I'm going to do. Thank you, Uncle." She hurriedly pressed all the money she'd saved into Uncle's waiting hands and whispered her instructions through the bars of her cell, watching as he ambled away from the woman's cell, while she prayed she would buy exactly what she had requested. Uncle had thought she'd gone crazy when he heard her request, but he replied sweetly, "How can I refuse such an innocent face?" Then he returned later that day. He delivered the package into Purnima's eager hands. "It's all there," Uncle assured her, "but I still think you're crazy. Prison will do that, you know." Purnima smiled her thanks and reached through the bars to shake his hand. Then she began making her preparations. As the others looked on, finally unable to hide their curiosity, they came right out and asked what in the world he was doing. But Purnima just ignored them and kept on working. It took her the rest of the afternoon, but she was determined to get it right. Finally, when she was done, she turned to the others and made her announcement. "Since I have been here, God has put it on my heart to save my prison allowance. I didn't know why until this morning, and then I knew what to do. I asked Uncle to use the money to buy the best chickens and vegetables he could find, and now I have cooked it all for you." Stunned into silence, the others looked on in amazement. Tulsa eyed her suspiciously, waiting for the catch and wondering why Purnima, to whom she had never uttered a kind word, would do such a thing. "And what are you talking about? What's the trick?" she asked sarcastically. "I just want to share it with you, Tulasa, with all of you. There's no trick. It's my gift to you. So let's eat." That evening, the inmates in the women's cell had the best meal they could remember. Even the guards were walking by and peering in. Word spread quickly through the prison. Purnima had prepared a feast. The following evening, Tulasa left her corner to come sit by Purnima. "Why did you do this for us?" she asked, sincere and courteous, for the first time in Purnima's presence. "We have done nothing but make fun of you and the others since you got here, and that was your money, all of it. You obviously could use it yourself, so why did you spend it on us?" The Thalassa simply couldn't grasp such kindness. She thought Purnima was either very foolish or very wise, and she wanted to find out which one applied. "Thalassa," Purnima began, a smile on her face, "have you ever heard of Christmas?" In this way, an unlikely friendship developed between a convicted murderer and a teenage preacher. Purnima told Thalassa the story of how she had trusted in Christ during a Christmas service nearly 3 years earlier. In her gentle but enthusiastic manner, over the next few months, Purnima spoke often to Thalassa about Christ, and incredibly, the two became close friends. In a small way, Thalassa reminded Purnima of her mother, and the girl felt comforted by the older woman's companionship. Although she didn't know what the future would hold, Purnima resolved to face it bravely. She recognized her weakness, but refused to let them imprison her. She would rise to the challenge and leave the rest to God, just as Moses had done. Epilogue. Purnima, along with the other Christians, was released from the prison after 14 months and 6 days. Word of their arrest had traveled back to the refugee camp and eventually spread around the world. An international collection of Christian leaders began to petition the Nepalese government for their release. "We know you are holding 11 Christians in the federal prison," they protested to the king of Nepal, "and one of them is only a child." Purnima and the others were later informed that their earlier release was only of a blessing was more of a blessing than they realized. The prison authorities had intended to keep them locked up for 7 years, the amended prison sentence for leading someone to convert to Christianity. Immediately after the release, to the surprise of the officials, they requested a meeting with their former cellmates. After 3 months of imprisonment, the Christians that had begun receiving help from their family members. Now they gave their cellmates the possessions they had collected, as well as the additional money Purnima had saved for another special occasion. And they reminded the others they had been persecuted because of their faith in Jesus Christ. Some of the other prisoners had become Christians and were encouraged to keep the faith. The 11 promised to remember them and all the other prisoners in their prayers. Remarkably, one of the men who had taken part in Ashok's beating came forward and said, "A bright light entered our prison, but now it is leaving." Just before leaving, Purnima hugged Thalassa, now a Christian. One last time, Thalassa was later released when her conviction was overturned. She is now an active leader in the church. From the first time Maya read at her Bible story, Purnima had admired Moses. He was exiled from his land, and even though he felt inadequate in speaking, God used him in a powerful way. In a similar manner, Purnima, who often felt inadequate because of her age, was now become somewhat of a celebrity around Nepal. She is frequently invited to share her testimony in churches surrounding the refugee camp, where she still lives with Maya, Silval, and her niece and nephew. Her prayer is that she will someday return to Bhutan, her homeland, and see her mother and to preach the gospel.